Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is a special Middle East edition of City Talk. The U.S. consulate in Saudi Arabia attacked. Quagmire and civil war in Iraq. Iran with the A-bomb. Arafat dead. Palestinian Israeli peace prospects alive. The Middle East, the cradle of civilization or the coffin for the world. To talk about Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Israel, and Islam is a long-time and distinguished Middle East hand. Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Mauritania, to Syria, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia, and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs during the Reagan years. He was particularly involved in the Arab-Israeli peace process, and he has been widely honored for his service to his country, including being named Career Ambassador, a title held by only 5 other officers at any time. He is a former senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a frequent TV commentator and widely consulted expert. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Doug. Pleasure.
First question. Saudi Arabia. 4 topics: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Israel, and Iran. Starting with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the Middle Eastern country that gets the most criticism from Americans. And Saudi Arabia has been labeled the greatest threats to U.S. interest in the world. What is the story with Saudi Arabia? What is the story with the Bush administration's involvement with Saudi Arabia?
Well, we used to say the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia was founded on two principles. One was that we would be ready to come to their aid against foreign aggression, which we did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Mm-hmm. And secondly, that they would make their energy sources, oil, gas, available to the world.
So this is the quid pro quo.
That was the way we used to describe it. When They went from being a very poor country, up in which they were until the 60s, to an extraordinarily wealthy country, at least as far as the per capita income went back in the early 80s. We were up to about $25,000 a head. It's a third of that today, but that's the population surge. They went from a country that was always very isolated and proud to be isolated, that felt they had a monopoly on the true practice of Islam, and they had the best practice, but they weren't really spreading it around the world till they got the big bucks from that surge in oil prices back in the 70s. Okay. Suddenly, billions of dollars available, and it's a very evangelistic country, if you will. They really like to spread the word.
And this pure form of Islam is called Wahhabism?
Well, Wahhabism is the name we give it because that's the name taken from the name of an 18th century figure who was linked to the Saud family as a religious thinker. But they call themselves Salafi, meaning those who were the immediate followers of the Prophet Muhammad.
So these are Islamic fundamentalists?
They're fundamentalists in the sense, yes, and have been for generations, in the sense that the Puritans saw themselves as fundamentalists in New England back in the 16th, 17th century.
So now they've got the bucks to export this version of Islam. And how did they do that?
Well, they've sent their own missionaries out throughout the Islamic world and, well, really all over the world. We've had a number in the States. They've funded mosques. They've funded Islamic schools. So that's the main way.
Are the Saudis exporting terrorism? It's a thesis of a book by Dor Gold, former ambassador from Israel to the UN, called Hatred's Kingdom. And he claims that Saudi Arabia is a prime sponsor of global terrorism. Do you see it that way?
No, I never have seen it Dor's way. with that amount of money and with a number of people who are not, frankly, very well educated among these missionary types going around, they've moved into areas like Afghanistan, like the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, Somalia, Nigeria, where the ministries of education are weak or non-existent in their reach. And they've provided free education, the basic reading, writing, memorization of the Quran. And when you've had that as the only curriculum, and you have a troubled political situation such as the Afghan situation, go forth and fight the Soviet Red Army and be of the first line of defenders of your faith, maybe those kids were easier to recruit because they had literally memorized the verses of the Quran and were told that jihad and the holy war was the way to go. But does Saudi Arabia as a government sponsor terrorism? No, I don't buy that.
Okay. You go back periodically to the region. When you go back to Saudi Arabia, what do you look for? What are the pieces of evidence for you that allow you to understand what's going on? What do you look for?
Well, I go back to many of, frankly, my old contacts in the government, in the business community. And as far as the government goes, they never heard the term limits out there. In fact, anywhere in the Middle East, be you Arab or Israeli, you're used to seeing the same cast of characters on top of the government, one after the other. So I come back as an old acquaintance and with a certain baseline of experience to look at, well, I went to Saudi Arabia first in the 1960s when I was a political officer, then back as ambassador in the 80s. And then I've continued to go back just about every year, once or twice. What I look for, the external signs of development, you can see those. You saw those in an explosive way, I mean literally economically explosive. Between the first time there in the 60s and my return in the 80s, suddenly Jeddah becomes a city of marble and great highways. Same with Riyadh. That was a large part of the city of Riyadh back in the 1960s was still mud brick construction. So you could see those physical changes. What you see are the enormous number of students in the universities, in the secondary schools. And you see, I mean, it's hard to get inside their minds, but you see a lot more young people, both men and women, getting through a college education than when I was first there 40 years back. What you also see, and this comes from talking to the government people, is a great concern that these kids are not getting a very good job market, getting into a good job market. There aren't the opportunities there were then when the government was small and growing. Now it's large but pretty static, and the economy, until this recent real surge in oil prices, it just wasn't diversified and creating jobs outside of the oil industry.
So you're developing a potentially dissatisfied education class.
Absolutely, yeah. And a very, very young population.
Are there parallels here to the situation in Iran in the late 1970s that led to the overthrow of the Shah? Are there similarities here in terms of undercurrents of dissatisfaction led by disgruntled university types, at least in part?
You will find dissident Saudis broadcasting, sending emails out of London. There's a group also in the States. In the country, you've had an opening of the media, their own press, to comments critical of government performance, never critical of the leadership of the royal family. Now they know they're under pretty clear self-censorship at least. But you get a sense that while things are changing, the country isn't in what I would call a pre-revolutionary mindset. There's resentment in terms of there's great wealth at one end, and there is poverty still. There always has been poverty, pockets of poverty in the kingdom. So you do have that resentment, and when the job opportunities aren't there, obviously that accelerates the sense of I'm not only disenfranchised, I can't vote,
Right.
but I can't get a job.
But the Saudis have been targets of bombings by terrorists, and they've been primarily, as far as I'm aware, they've been Saudis that have done it. So you've got a society, in a sense, at war with itself. And in fact, the 9/11, the vast majority of the 19 was Saudis. So the regime itself, have they been slow to recognize their own, the generation of the problem from within?
They heard it. They heard themselves attacked by Osama bin Laden, a Saudi originally, as early as 93, 94. But I have to say, I don't think it really turned them on or sensitized them to the danger from within until they were hit just last year. I think it was May of 2003, when targets were selected in Riyadh, compounds known to be settled in residents of other countries, foreign Arabs, Westerners, but also Saudis died at that time. And the cooperation which we had mapped out in Washington back in beginning in October 2001, within weeks after the World Trade Center bombing, the cooperation was formal and correct, but slow in developing. As of May of last year, when they were themselves targeted, and then subsequently they were hit in the eastern province, in Dhahran, Dammam, in Yanbor, then again, most recently in Jeddah these few days ago, that really caught their attention. And the police have been doing their best, and the intelligence circuit there has been doing its best to penetrate the groups, the dissidents, and arrest them and kill them.
What is the nature of the Bush administration's foreign policy with Saudi Arabia? How do they see the Saudis strategically? What is the horizon in front of us in terms of U.S.-Saudi relations?
I think the basic elements are still there. We are very concerned about the stability of the country sitting on that enormous reserve of oil and gas. And it's a nightmare vision that has Saudi Arabia go into a revolution and those sources be cut back or cut off for however long or short a period it might be.
That would be a disastrous strategic
It would be disastrous
concept
for the world. We're not the main customers these days, or if we are, we change between number one, number two buyer with Asia.
Yeah,
it's
the
increasingly
Chinese
going
and
to Asia.
Asians are increasingly dependent and buying Saudi oil.
That's where the traffic's going. But they're with this great amount of oil, and with a very skilled management in their oil industry that has kept ahead until very recently of world demand by building in excess capacity. I think they're the only producing state that has any excess capacity. It's about a little over 1 million barrels a day now, which is in reserve to be added as needed. But our worry would be the cutoff of that, and added to that, ever since 9/11, and I think we lunged maybe without looking at some of the realities in Saudi Arabia and accusing them of being responsible for 9/11. That sort of talk was the airwaves were full of. 15 of those hijackers were Saudi, and however they were recruited, the fact is they were probably the easiest group to get into the United States because it was a rubber stamp operation for the consul. His main concern was, are you going to go back to your own country wherever he's stationed?
Right.
Are you going to go back to Italy, back to Ireland, back to Saudi Arabia? The answer for the Saudis was yes. That's where the opportunity is. That's where the family is. I'll go back, and they did. So it was no sweat to get an American visa.
Okay, now 2 years, 3 years down the line, what are we going to see in Saudi Arabian Bush administration policy? Continuation of the present policy of essentially protecting the Saudis under our umbrella and making sure that the current regime is in place?
Well, we're never going to be in the position of put ourselves in the position of putting ourselves between the Saudi people and the regime. They've got to manage that themselves. We were there to defend against the foreign aggression, be it Egypt, be it Iraq or Iran.
Right. And those threats still exist, I would presume.
Well,
certainly from
they
Iran.
still see from Iran, on the surface, it's a cordial or correct relationship today, but they're uneasy about that. Yes, we'd like to maintain a good relationship and as close as possible, but 9/11 did change things, and we inserted into the relationship the need for extremely close political intelligence exchange on the where these gangs were coming from, where the training was going on, and trying to bring the Saudi network, so to speak, into the global picture, so that we could share information, and that's gone pretty well, is my understanding.
Okay, let's move now to Iraq. At the top of the show, I talked about quagmire and civil war. Are these apt characterizations of the present situation in Iraq?
Oh, the immediate situation, quagmire probably fits. Yeah, it's not a popular word to use if you're in the administration, but that's we don't see the way out right now.
How do we get out?
I think the shortest way out is an election at the end of January.
That's going to happen?
Well, it's so far so good. That's what all the effort is being made, is to clear up the security situation to the point that all the voting places can be used. And particular concern is the Sunni Arab triangle.
Are you sanguine that the security will be able to be maintained?
Not completely sanguine, no, because I think the prediction that there would be more violence, intensified violence between now and the end of January is dead right. I think there's going to be a lot. Because who's fighting? Who wants to forestall the elections?
Please.
The guys who either stand to lose forever the privileges and the status they had under Saddam Hussein.
And they are, variously.
Various numbers in the Ba'ath Party. Certainly some in the military whom we put out of business as a whole when we dissolved the army last year.
In a religious sense, Sunnis versus Shiites and versus Kurds?
Well, it's a country that the British, as they say, pasted together back in the early 20s.
Talk to us about that.
Well, they took 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire that the Ottomans ran out of Istanbul. And the northern area was basically the Kurdish area. The central was always a mix of Sunni and Shia and some Kurds, and then the main part of the south was Shia. And the south in those days included what is today the independent state of Kuwait. So they put them together, and with great difficulty in those days. I can remember an article I was reading of the London Times of 1921, criticizing the way the government had bungled the handling of Iraq, which was then Mesopotamia. The politicians had bungled it, the army had bungled it, and they had 90,000 troops in Iraq in those days, and they couldn't control things, while the British forces in Egypt, with twice the population, Egyptians versus Iraqi, needed only 5,000 troops. What was going wrong? A lot of questions in London at that time. Well, the British stayed, and they had put in power Faisal of Iraq, who had come out of Mecca, one of the sons of the Sharif of Mecca. They maintained him in power, and he was, in his own person, a fairly popular leader. And they had a dominant foreign presence there in terms of Britain up until the Iraqi Revolution in '58. And that brought to power the military, and then soon thereafter the Ba'ath Party, with Saddam being the final flowering of the Ba'ath.
So we've got, I mean, given my limited perspective on it, you've got geographic divisions based on ethnicities, histories, and cultures, and then you've got religious differences between the Sunnis and the Shiites, and then you've got the added secular versus religious. You've got all these cleavages. Can this be put together, or is this going to fly apart? Is it too centrifugal?
Well, to answer that question, you need more expertise in Iraq than I bring to your table today. But let me quote one friend who is probably our best single expert, Phoebe Marr, who's written a couple of good histories on Iraq. She does believe that 80 years, starting with the British mandate and, as I say, domination of that almost a half century, in 80 years there was a sense of coming together. And it was achieved through great brutality, ruthlessness, particularly under Saddam, but he wasn't the first to be ruthless in that country. The country's been put together. They know they're not Syrians. They certainly know they're not Iranians or Saudis. So there is a certain identity today to being an Iraqi. Is it strong enough to overcome some of these deeper fissures, being Shia, being Sunni? Well, in the old days, which is up until the Americans arrived with an invading force, the Sunnis, only 20% of the population, had managed for centuries to dominate that region. And the British had made sure they were in positions of power for the 80 years.
And essentially, the insurgency that the United States Armed Forces are facing is essentially a Sunni insurgency, but it seems to be so much more complicated than that. Well, what are we dealing with on the ground in Iraq in terms of this insurgency?
Well, we have pulled off the trick, if you will, of uniting the forces of nationalism. And that's why I spoke first of there is something called Iraqi or Arab, at least Arab nationalism. We put them in sync with the religious extremists. The religious extremists, by and large, throughout the Arab world, are few and unable to have mass appeal, at least mass appeal to the point of going out and getting a whole mob or a whole wide cut of the population behind them. But when you link that up with national feeling, and that happened with the invasion, once again the foreigner, whitey if you will, is coming into our country as he did with the British and as the Turks did for all those earlier centuries and trying to dominate us. The Iraqis are very allergic to any outsider sitting on their head. So we put them together, the nationalists with the extremists.
So sort of a law of perverse consequences. You do exactly what you don't want to do?
Yeah. I'm afraid so.
How did we get to the point where we succeeded in producing our worst outcome, or a terrible outcome, if you will, both for the United States in terms of its national interest and perhaps Iraq in terms of its national interest?
Well, to be crude about it, we didn't know what we were doing when we went in there. We didn't, of all the major Arab countries, we probably understood Iraq the least. And I say that because when I was Assistant Secretary, we reestablished relations, diplomatic relations with Baghdad, 1984, with the exchange of ambassadors. There had been no relations, or very limited, from 1967, the Six-Day War, up till 1984. That embassy was closed down in 1990 and not reopened until this year. So in the, 37 years, you had 6 years of a full presence. Now, an official government presence isn't the whole story to understanding another country, but it does give you a basis to create political links, economic, commercial, military, intelligence, what you will. Under Saddam, even those 6 years, they didn't flourish because his police control was such that any Iraqi was scared to death to be seen talking to an American or a British or any other foreign representative. So we weren't very knowledgeable at all about the dynamics of the society.
There have been some of us who have talked about the parallels between Vietnam and Iraq, and those parallels seem to be what you're talking about here, that we went into a war based on sort of a combination of ignorance and arrogance. There's a hubris here. There's almost the same story with the best and the brightest with the Rumsfeld and his defense whiz kids. I mean, don't we learn from history?
Rarely.
This is not good. Are the parallels real enough to provide any meaningful analysis or prescription for us now?
Well, you remember in, I guess it was called the Powell Doctrine, about having a clear exit strategy when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, before you go in, you know how you're going to get out, or you have a plan at least. There was a lot of wishful thinking about what we'd find when we went in there. Yes, people were grateful, but it lasted a very short time to be rid of Saddam.
One of the striking things seems to be the buying of these concepts by defense intellectuals, or selling of these concepts. In Vietnam, we had the domino effect, that if one country fell to communism, the whole string of countries would fall. And there seems to be almost a benign domino theory behind Rumsfeld and the Defense Department, that if you overthrow a regime and you democratize it, that 1,000 democracies would bloom. Are they naive?
Yeah, negative or positive as dominoes go. Politics doesn't always, they don't flip over
fall the right
so
way.
Easily, right? Well, what I heard said, and I was out of the country through most of the Vietnam days, so you're got a better memory of this than I would have. But I was told that it was fairly often said, within every Vietnamese, there's an American struggling to be born. That was what we thought. Mm-hmm. Well, I swear you hear the same assumption about the Arabs, that they're just yearning for the American way of life. And it ain't happening. No, they like a lot of what they see about us. They don't hate our freedom. They don't hate our values. It's not that, but they don't want to be American. They've got their own history and culture and traditions.
Okay, we've run out of time for this segment, and we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to continue talking about Iraq. We're going to talk about Israel and Palestinians, and we're going to talk about Iran. So we will be with each other again.
Thank you.